Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Healing the Spirit. Today, I want to share some thoughts, reflections, and contemplations on the idea of trends, traditions, and finding our own truth within spiritual practices. This theme feels very alive, especially at the time of recording this for me. I'm recording this in the midst of Cancer season. We are in between two full moons in Capricorn, and I'm recording this on Saturday, July 6, 2024. It's the day after the new moon in Cancer. And when we're thinking about Capricorn and Cancer, we are also thinking and talking about Saturn and the moon, right? Saturn being the ruler of Capricorn and the moon being the ruler of Cancer. And so both of these planets are related in that, first and foremost, the cycle of Saturn is about 28 years and the cycle of the moon is about 28 and a half days, right? So already there's a numerical consideration there. There's a mirroring that happens, and we can reflect on what this means, right? Saturn speaks to the tradition that we maybe received from generations before us, parents, teachers, elders, and the moon also speak to traditions, but perhaps traditions that we carry in our day-to-day rituals, right? To me, the moon speaks to the tradition of, for example, when I wake up, first thing I do is I drink my coffee and then I take a shower in order to jumpstart my day. And these things become traditions over time, right? These things become what upholds my daily reality, even though it seems very mundane. You know, I may or may not have learned that from my family of origin, say, but it still speaks to a way in which I tend to my daily reality, right? And so both the tradition of Saturn and kind of the ever changing everyday ritual of the moon are together what keep us intact, right? What kind of keep us together, helps us move through our daily reality. And it also begs the question of, what do we do with our spiritual practices that we have learned maybe from teachers? Um, and how do we make it make sense in the context of our lives, in the context of the very specific challenges that each generation faces, right? This is an experience that I've had to contend with because some people that I studied with are not within my age bracket, right? And so it's something that I've kind of had to process in my own reality. And it feels particularly alive right now because I'm currently preparing to teach a class called Deep Spirit Medicine, which I will share more with all of you about probably in a couple days or so. And if this offering feels interesting to you, I welcome you to join the waitlist. It is an energy work modality that I've practiced for about 4 to 5 years now, and it was taught to me by one of my teachers and mentors, Deborah Kremens. And so, because this work is a part of a lineage that I was trained in, it does make me reflect on the reality of trends and traditions within spiritual work. And specifically, it's making me think about how certain modalities kind of come in and out of focus within the specific niche of like a particular generation, right? Like I belong to the millennial generation. And so a lot of people my age found their spiritual practices through social media, through Instagram. And I found it really interesting over time that I've noticed certain modalities, certain frameworks are really in vogue when I first started taking my spiritual journey and education seriously, but then maybe kind of went away, or matured into something else that may not have as much clout around it anymore, right? And so yeah, this is really making me think about how do we access our own truth, right? How do we allow our relationships to trends as well as to traditions to help us get closer to finding our personal truth rather than kind of become distractions, right? Because both trends and traditions can absolutely be a distraction when we use them or when we interact with them in the way that's maybe a little unhealthy for us, right? Um, I also am reminded of what one of my astrologer colleagues told me about one time, Aaron Shipley. Aaron was on the podcast when we talked about the astrology of 2024. And sometime this past year, if I remember correctly, Aaron mentioned something to me about how, I am kind of like a spiritual tour guide because um, I am trained in a lot of different modalities by design. This is something that is interesting to me. I practice a lot of different modalities. And throughout, what I found in being a person who is attracted to a lot of different traditions, a lot of different tools, frameworks, modalities, teachers, is one, how important it is for us to really cultivate a clear sense of what our values are so that we can be discerning, right? When we move through these different spaces and interact with different communities and different teachers, and also the importance of really feeling into what works for me at this moment in my life, right? That some tools may be really helpful or useful at certain times in our lives, but then we may move through a different period where it's no longer useful. I spoke more about this in the last episode that I published, called Rubber Spirituality, where I talk about this idea of what is your spiritual practice when the rubber meets the road, right? And what does that even look like for you? Because I think everybody has a different idea about why they even want to have a spiritual practice or why they even want to cultivate this spiritual dimension in their own lives and in their own being. Um, the idea of trends within spiritual spaces is very interesting because I think in some ways it feels like an oxymoron. There is a way in which I think, at least within certain frameworks or philosophies, we think that spirituality needs to be evergreen. Spirituality needs to be speaking to a universal truth, right? And the idea of spiritual trends feel kind of strange because um, if something is true, there shouldn't be any trends, right? There should just be one way to do something that's true in a way. And I think one way to contextualize this, or one way to understand the phenomenon of trends within spiritual spaces and communities, is to recognize that our spirituality is not really separate from our humanity, right? Our spirituality can open us up to a sense that there's something divine, something larger than us and our lives and our circumstances and our personalities. But ultimately, when we practice our spiritual tools, right, or when we apply our spiritual frameworks, they can never be 100% separate from our humanity, right? We are still the ones practicing them. And so, in a way, I think about this in terms of how human activities, regardless of the nature of the activities themselves, are always kind of moving in trends, right? We are obviously impacted by larger forces. We're impacted by collective forces. We're impacted by the planets. We're impacted by larger energies that may come from this lifetime or maybe other lifetimes, right, or other dimensions. And we're also impacted by what I'm considering as the weird or the Tao or the path or whatever you want to call that larger force that shapes our individual paths are, right, and our collective paths are. And something that we have noticed is that these larger forces move in cycles. If you study a lot of spiritual traditions or kind of esoteric um, knowledge, this is something that people talk a lot about, right? The idea of the Ouroboros, for example, like this circle, the serpent that's kind of eating its own tail, right? Is quite prevalent and it's alive in a lot of different traditions in many different parts of the world because there is that cyclical nature of this larger force, right? And this is something we can also see in other dimensions of life. Like, for example, fashion absolutely moves in cycles. Trends in music moves in cycles, right? There was a time when folk music, I still remember this because I lived through it. Folk music was really having a renaissance. Maybe this was around 2011, 2012, circa. And it's kind of not anymore. It's not really like at the center of the culture anymore. Astrology itself is a study of cycles, right? When we look at the movements of the planets, they absolutely move in cycles. We talk a lot about the cycles of the moon, the lunar cycle. Um, Earlier in this episode, I was mentioning how I'm recording this in between two full moons in Capricorn, right? This is something that happens every year, which is we get two full moons that are in the same sign, even though the sign changes every year, right? But this is something that is always going to be the case. Like within one Gregorian calendar year, we have 13 moon cycles, and so um, yeah, this is always kind of alive. This is always something that um, I think we see patterns and cycles in nature, right? And so because we as humans are part of nature, we also can't help but move in cycles. And so that's one way to think about trends, right? That certain modalities, certain traditions, certain frameworks kind of come in and out of the consciousness of the quote unquote mainstream within spiritual cycles, right? Even though um, probably the mainstream of spiritual cycle circles is so much smaller than like the larger mainstream that we talk about when we talk about, for example, movies, right? Or other kind of relevant areas in culture. But still, there is kind of that mainstream, right? Like there's an undeniable sense that when we are, taking classes, for example, or when we join certain communities, we can notice that certain communities have more of an energy towards them, or people start talking about them a lot more. This is something I have heard from some of my human design teachers. When they were first starting out um, in the 90s or even the late 80s, right? This isn't something that people talk about. And in fact, when people brought up the idea of human design, it was kind of weird at that time, right? And likewise, I also see this, for example, from the perspective of my teachers, mentors, and elders who are in the energy work space, because energy work was really huge in the 60s and the 70s, and I am noticing that my generation, like among the millennial practitioners, there's maybe a little bit less of us, for some reason, right? Um, so one way we can think about this is in terms of these larger forces. When we're talking about planetary cycles, when we're talking about even generational signatures, we can think about Pluto as a signature for generations, right? Um, Pluto in Libra generation probably faces very different experiences. Um, values different things and have different challenges than Pluto and Scorpio generation. And the Pluto and Scorpio generation faces different challenges than the Pluto in Sagittarius generation, right? This is something I noticed, for example, for me as a Pluto and Scorpio person, is I didn't grow up with my smartphone on my hand all day long. Like I did not have TikTok when I was 18. Right? I remember actually when I first joined Facebook. I think I was maybe 16, 15 or 16. And nowadays, kids have Facebook when they're like 8, right? And that's such a different orientation. I remember when I was in high school, that was when Wikipedia started becoming really a tool that we use, right? In school for doing research. And prior to that, like I had to go to the library. I had to go check out these books and I had to create my reports, which is probably not an experience. If you're listening to this and you're 17 years old, you probably have never had that experience of needing to go to the library and check out the books. I mean, obviously you can, but you're not obligated to because you have the internet, right? And so each generation faces very different challenges. And I think one way we can think about spiritual trends is that our spiritual practices are often woven in because there's a certain need, right? Our spiritual practices um, fulfill, or at the very least, they address certain needs within us, right? And each generation have their own unique kind of collective needs. And so it makes sense that the spiritual practices that they gravitate towards, the framework they gravitate towards, are a little bit different. And then there's also maybe the not so savory side of spiritual trends, right? Which is personality cults, celebrity cult, right? The cult of celebrity. And I think when it comes to the spiritual circles, what I've noticed is, we have moved through such an evolution with regards to these personalities that in my opinion, is pretty astounding. Like if you look back at the 60s, right, you still see a lot of people who are totally toxic gurus, and I'm not saying they don't exist anymore now, but I do think that on a collective level, we have gotten to a point where we've become so discerning as people who practice spiritual tools, traditions, who belong to like different spiritual communities, that I think we've just gotten better at like noticing people whose values don't really align with us, or who are trying to teach us things that don't totally make sense, right? So there's definitely progress there. I think we have kind of eradicated a lot of the guru mentality that maybe was very prevalent earlier in 20th century, in the mid 20th century. However, I do think it still exists, right? Like maybe in very subtle ways, there's still like celebrities within spiritual circles, which is always so funny to me. Like when I see kind of a celebrity figure or people treating, people that they listen to or people that they study with, um, as celebrities, there's always something about that kind of makes me laugh a little bit, um, because it's such a part of human nature, right? Like we want to believe that um, there's someone else kind of doing it better than we can, And I think that this is very nuanced, right? In my life, I've really gotten a lot from hanging out basically around teachers and mentors who are more experienced in the modalities that I am interested in honing my skills in, right? And I've also really benefited from people who maybe are newer to their spiritual modality but have had more life experiences. Just kind of being around people who have a little bit more experience um, feels comforting, feels good, feels grounding. And also, the longer that I spend within different spiritual circles and communities, the more I recognize the importance of really doing my own work. And what I mean by really doing my own work is that um, when we get close to people, inevitably we start to notice that they're humans too. We start to notice that they have strengths and weaknesses just like we do. No matter how smart they are, or how disciplined they are, or how knowledgeable or experienced they are, ultimately, there's going to be something about them that don't totally, I don't know, like is kind of like to you, right? Like it that's always the case when we have human relationships. I mean, think about, you know, um some of your favorite humans, like maybe some of your favorite friends, or like your partner, or even maybe like your child, right? Like in the beginning, you might be like, wow, like this person is such a gift, and then the more you get to know them, the more you are like, okay, I think they're still amazing, but some aspects of who they are drive me nuts, right? Anyways, I'm kind of digressing from the point here a little bit. My point really is that I think what I've seen that I haven't really heard people talk about is that certain modalities kind of come to the forefront. Certain traditions come to the forefront, especially when someone kind of famous started teaching them, or become practitioners, right? This is something I've seen recently with regards to Taoism, actually. It's very interesting because I remember maybe about like 10 years ago when I was first starting to meditate and I started to be really interested in astrology. Like Buddhism was like all the rave. It was everybody was a Buddhist, right? I think if you are a millennial, you will remember the period of time I'm talking about. And then recently, I've noticed there have been a lot of conversations around people quitting Buddhism for whatever reason, right? Each person kind of had their own um, reasons for it. Maybe certain aspects of the practices no longer resonate with them, or the frameworks don't resonate, or maybe the communities or the teachers are not really like a good match anymore. And like you see droves of people kind of going into Taoism, and I bet you within 10, 15 years, you'll see kind of some of the same movements into maybe like Hinduism, right? Or some other ism that um, is like the ism du jour, right? Like the framework or the lineage that's like that people are curious about, and I think it makes sense because we are humans. We look towards other humans, right? And especially when it comes to our spirituality, because often the only way to really learn some of these spiritual frameworks and practices is through conversations with another actual human being, right? It's very hard to learn spiritual traditions from just reading books. I mean, in fact, I am a self professed nerd. And, if you see my apartment, you will see that I have tons of books. But what I've found time and time again is that certain modalities just don't lend themselves well to like reading books. This is something I have experienced with human design. This is something I have experienced with astrology. Like I bought a bunch of astrology books for many, many years, read them, but nothing seemed to synthesize or coalesce. I seem to still find it really difficult to understand the system as a whole until I started to have a teacher that I can talk to, that I can discuss this stuff with, right? And somehow the progress was expedited like so quickly the moment I have a teacher, right? And so in a way, it makes sense that we look to other humans because maybe, at least for some people, we need to learn our spiritual practices through other humans and contact with other humans. But I think something to consider here too is that sometimes things enter the consciousness of the um, larger group of people because there are personalities that are attractive, right? There are personalities that are interesting that people want to hear from, and that kind of brings some modalities to the forefront. So I've been on both ends of this, right? I've been on the end of cultivating relationships with practices, teachers, frameworks that are in, right? And then I've also been on the end of having relationships with practices, teachers, and frameworks that are not kind of in the mainstream at the moment, right? And I think what's interesting to reflect on, at least for me, it's been really interesting to track this within myself and within students and clients, um, is my own response to being kind of, or practicing something that's like in vogue versus practicing something that's like not in vogue, right? And I think this is a very nuanced and complicated theme, because and discussion because it probably, at least in my case, I've noticed that it reflects my own relationship to being in the mainstream current, right? Or having some sort of um, power in numbers, if that makes sense. Um, there have been times where I practice certain things, right, that are not in vogue, and it's felt amazing because it's almost like, when you're traveling and you go into a little spot that like the other tourists don't really know about, but then there are locals there, and then it's just kind of like the right amount of crowded, um, or like maybe it's more like lively than crowded, right? And there's a space for you to like sit and vibe, and you just feel like you won the lottery, because you're like, okay, the food is amazing here. I really enjoy the spot. I really enjoy the vibe, and I don't have to cram with everybody else, right? But there are also times where I practice certain modalities that other people are not practicing, and it feels really, really lonely. It feels like I'm the only person interested in this, and then maybe I want to talk about some of the topics that come up or some of my questions and contemplations. And I started talking about it, and people don't really know what I'm talking about, right? Or people respond in a way that makes it clear to me that they don't really have the prerequisite information necessary and the background necessary in order to respond to me in a way that maybe I want to be responded to, right? This is certainly something that I've experienced when I started to learn a little bit more about Taoism. I started talking about it with some of my astrology friends, and I realized not a lot of people are into Taoism in the circles that I currently operate in, right? Which again doesn't mean that there's not a lot of people practicing or who have knowledge of Taoism in general, but it's just that my connections thus far haven't really been exposed to this particular tradition, right? And so, and likewise, for example, with astrology, like I really started taking my astrological studies seriously at the time when astrology was really on the rise. Like people were really starting to get very curious about astrology, get really into astrology. And what I've noticed is there's some other type of challenge there, right? Which is, probably if I started learning astrology before astrology was like really popular, or at least like really on that massive incline towards like the height of its popularity, I wouldn't feel so ick about, creating astrological memes. First of all, no shade. I love astrology memes. So if you are someone who creates an account with astrology memes, bless you. That is such a beautiful service if you see it as such. Um, but I remember, there's a part of me that's like, like I want to be more of a serious astrologer, at least the first couple years of my studies. And that some of you may be able to relate to. If you have been learning astrology or if you've been listening to this podcast, you may be that kind of person too, who kind of, shies away from the intensity of what everybody else is doing, right? And yeah, that push and pull is very interesting to track. And I think it can really teach us a lot when we ask ourselves, what's behind that feeling, right? Or what's behind that reaction towards what quote unquote everybody else is doing or not doing, right? I also think that people move in groups. We are social animals and we are led by resonance to one another. And so our practices, our teachers, our communities often can point to us some things that maybe we need to see within ourselves, right? Because sometimes we're attracted to people not because factually they have something in common with us, but because we sense that they have something in common with us, right? I think there's a bit of a distinction there. Like, I think it's dangerous to assume that just because you're drawn to someone that they have something in common for you, in common with you, or something to teach you. But I have found it to be true that usually when I'm drawn to someone or a community or like a practice or a container, there usually is something that I'm here to see about that attraction, right? There's something I'm kind of maybe projecting a little bit onto these people, these practices, these communities that speak to something that I'm wanting to see within myself. I would even argue that part of the reason why we are attracted to one another is because there are certain aspects of our being that only kind of come alive when we are in the presence of other people, right? This is, if you are into the technicality of astrology, you can maybe understand this in terms of, like, for example, the eighth house or the 12th house, right? Like, I'm a Virgo rising, so on my eighth house is Aries, and on my 12th house, the sign that rules my 12th house is Leo, right? And I found throughout my spiritual studies that I'm very drawn to people with strong Aries and Leo placements because maybe there's a part of me that wants to cultivate more of that within myself, right? And I see that in them, regardless of whether they actually have it or that's part of their self concept. And um, part of what I'm actually learning through being around them is cultivating these qualities, right? And giving myself permission to embrace more of these qualities in my own life. And maybe from the perspective of human design, we can think about like hanging gates, right? The hanging gates in our body graph are often speaking to us. Um, they want to be met, right? Like there's, if we have a hanging gate, the other gate that's on the other side is often what is needed for us to feel complete. So we might find teachers who can complete some of these circuits for us, right? And or some of these channels for us. Um, and truly listening to our intuition, truly listening to our resonance is kind of a complex practice, and it's a big ask. And so I kind of want to step out maybe of this conversation around trends a little bit and talk about it from the lens of, being a practitioner, right? First, let's talk about, if you are a practitioner who do this professionally, it can be very disheartening to try to start your practice when the modality that you care about or that you practice in that you're practicing is not kind of invoke, right? Because you might find that if you offer services, there may be other people who offer different types of modalities or sessions that are kind of more in demand or maybe making a better living than you are because they're practicing a modality that's currently in vogue and the market is looking for that kind of support, right? Or is aware that that kind of support is needed for them or wanted. It can also be very disheartening if you start out when the modality is really in and then everybody wants sessions, everybody wants to learn from you. And then, maybe you do it for 2, 3 years and then it kind of goes out of vogue, right? This is something that I have noticed, with a lot of my colleagues and friends. Um, a lot of us started out when astrology was really on the incline, and then there will be periods, which where maybe uh we have less clients, you know, pure and simple. Like nothing has changed. In fact, maybe we have uh matured in our craft, right? We have matured in our spiritual perspectives, and yet we might find it difficult to like have a fully booked practice, and that can also feel disheartening, right? And it can make you feel like, is there anything wrong with how I'm practicing? When that's the case, right? My experience with energy work and energy cultivation is really instructive for me around this because I basically started my journey learning energy work at the same time that I was learning astrology seriously. But in some ways, it kind of feels like energy work wasn't really something that a lot of people in my age bracket really resonated with, or was really kind of, I guess, let me put it this way. People weren't really hounding at my door to get energy readings, even though I talk about being trained in this modality as well. And I thought that was really interesting because it may be something, it may speak to who I am or my relationship with the modality, or maybe it just spoke to the people who are drawn to me. Like maybe that's not the kind of service that they are looking for, Um, so I find that interesting, right? And in that sense, I can see how there's an interaction between how quickly I go from learning the modality, apprenticing with a mentor, to having my own practice doing sessions with that particular modality based on how invoked the modality is. I think this is not something that a lot of people maybe like to talk about, but I definitely see the correlation in my own personal and professional practices. Um, I think it can also be really overwhelming, conversely, right? This is kind of on the other side of it. It can be really overwhelming when you're trying to learn a modality and the modality is in vogue and a lot of people claim expertise. You might find it kind of crazy. It might feel like entering into this jungle and you have no idea how to navigate the jungle because there are so many practitioners, so many podcasts, so many resources available. But wading through those resources until you get to a point where you find someone that feels like a good match for you and who has a grounded understanding of the modality can take a while. This was definitely my case with human design because, um, first of all, I kind of came into human design from astrology. So there's a part of me that I think in the beginning um, kind of creates this competition, right? Maybe unconsciously between astrology and human design. Like there's a part of me that feels like if I start taking my human design studies seriously, maybe I'm less of an astrologer or I don't know, something like that, right? But I will admit that it took me a while to feel ready to apprentice with the right teachers, and um, I feel like in that sense with human design, I was very lucky because the first person I had a reading from was Kelsey Rose Tortorici, who has been on the podcast. That reading really resonated. And then I had a reading with Brynja Magnuson, who also has been on the podcast. And that reading was like life changing for me. And I felt so seen, and I felt very like that was the time when I was like, oh, there's really something here for me to learn, you know? And then I started learning from Kelsey, and then I found the work of John Cole and Amy Lee of Human Design Collective, which were also Kelsey's teachers. And so, in that sense, I feel like I kind of fell into the right lineage, I guess, with human design. Like, I found that their approach was really comprehensive and really rooted and grounded in a way that, um, you know, some of the human design memes that I see out there um, don't really, I don't know, like something felt missing to me about the transmission. I can't always describe it, and maybe it's just because of who I am, but something, I don't know, something didn't click, you know? And so yeah, I just want to acknowledge that there can be a myriad of experiences here, right? There can be a range of experiences that we have with this um yeah, with this phenomenon of different modalities or frameworks being in vogue or out of vogue. And I think that this also can be true for practitioners who only want to cultivate their own personal practices, right? You may notice that there's a shift if you are sensitive energetically. When you practice a modality or you are learning something that a lot of other people are learning versus you're practicing or learning something that not a lot of other people are learning. Um, there is kind of this invisible collective current that can impact our personal practices, right? I think a great story that I can tell about this was one of the modalities that I was really drawn to at the very start of my spiritual journey was transcendental meditation. And um, in the transcendental meditation universe, right, something that's quite huge was the idea of people meditating together. There's this idea that, you know, if we all kind of meditate in the same room together or we meditate at the same time together, there's power in um, the energy that we kind of raise through that collective act, right? And in a way, I found that I can definitely see that, you know, practicing alone when not many others are interested in practicing a modality or talking about these practices or these lineages or these concepts can feel really isolating. And there may not be as much energy behind it when the modality is not kind of in vogue. Right? It's kind of like, you know, listening to an album or a song that used to be really popular, but then people don't listen to it anymore. Right? In a way, maybe the lack of frenzy around it helps you see the details better, right? Helps you actually interact with the song in a way that's more personal to you. But it can also take a little bit more focus and willpower to get into it, you know? Um, yeah. So, what I want to talk about next is the idea of tradition. Um, as spiritual practices and lineages mature, what I've seen is they often run into this issue of, can these practices, these modalities survive the generational changes? Something that I remember reading from one of Demetra George's books, I think it was the Ancient Astrology book, was something along the lines of every generation will find a way to find techniques that can speak to the concerns that they have for that generation. And I really appreciated hearing this perspective from someone like Demetra George, who, one, has been doing astrology and has been studying these ancient texts for a very long time, right? And two, someone who also has modeled in her own professional practice the reality of mutation, right? Something that I've always thought interesting about Demetra George is the fact that she started out pretty much as a modern astrologer, and then she kind of got pulled into learning these ancient texts, and then that shifts her practices, right? And so I think this is something that we can embrace a little bit more within spiritual circles and within spiritual communities, because the reality is, I don't think traditions are static. Traditions are living because traditions are practiced by people, and people are always changing, right? So it's easy to believe that there's such a thing as static traditions, especially because we currently live within a culture, within modernity, especially in the West, that upholds the materialist scientific worldview, right? There's this idea that, okay, if somebody wrote a textbook about it, it's absolutely right. We need to continue practicing in that way, right? But we can see how even this idea, right, is um, not applicable to things like science. It's kind of funny, actually. It's a bit of a paradox because we call it the materialist scientific worldview, but actually science is always being updated. Science is always changing itself. Science is always pushing itself to ask new questions, right? And so why wouldn't our spiritual traditions, why wouldn't our human traditions be the same, right? It's not like math where 1 plus 1 equals 2. Rather, it is inevitably always processed through the lens and the experiences of the humans who practice them. So the process of transmitting knowledge, right? Transmitting understanding, transmitting practices and rituals from teachers to students, from mentors to mentees, from one generation to the next, necessarily change something about the knowledge itself, right? The knowledge and the traditions are expanded because of the act of transmission, right? Recently, I think it was Michelle Pelizon who reminded me that um, some of the traditions that ended up dying are traditions who are not really open to being shifted and are not really open to um, kind of adapting to the times, right, and to the concerns that their constituents have, and this idea of kind of holding on tightly to the way we've always done things. I think it can be really beautiful, and it can also be really dangerous, right? And there's probably a time and a place for kind of holding on to certain things that lie at the core of practices. And there's also something to be said about allowing shifts, changes, mutations, maybe even an expansion of interpretations to happen, right? I also want to mention a concept that I've heard being talked about that really, really resonated with me, which is this idea that traditions and modalities have spirits too, right? They have agency that may have led them to that mutation. There's something about modalities like astrology, or the tarot, or um, energy work, you know, even though energy work is kind of a broad term, right? That I feel are really tied to some larger field of consciousness, right? You may want to call them spirits, you may want to call them um, archetypes, or whatever other words may resonate for you. But I do think that this larger field of consciousness that shrouds these modalities, um, they also have their own sense of trajectory, right? And they have their own sense of, what needs to stay the same and what needs to shift a little bit in order for the survival of that modality, in order for the survival of those practices, right? So let's bring this down to the practical as people who are interested in having spiritual practices. If you are listening to this podcast, I bet you are, because, in the past 2 years or so, I've been sharing my weekly contemplations, and I've heard from a lot of you about how the act of tuning in weekly have been helpful for you, right? And so, in a sense, even just tuning in to the astrology through my lens was a practice for you, right? And was a practice for me too. And so, what do we do as people who are interested in having a dynamic spiritual life that really wants to kind of find our truth, or at least find what feels true to us amidst these considerations, right, of trends and traditions and all that. Um, Something that I think about a lot is the importance of our values, right? And the importance of, for example, for me, two values that I find very, very crucial and really live at the center of my being is the idea of balancing devotion and curiosity. We can maybe conceptualize this astrologically through the lens of Virgo and Gemini, right? Both of them are the homes of Mercury, right? They're the landscapes of Mercury. And so there's something here about how Virgo is able to show up, right? Kind of on a consistent basis, and be in that spirit of tending. And then Gemini is ever curious, is not afraid to ask the big questions, or the small questions for that matter, right? Um, that to me, balancing devotion with curiosity means approaching our practices, approaching our modalities from a space of um, truly giving them the time and the space that they need in order to teach us what they want to teach us, right? While at the same time, not being afraid to, like, question them, and maybe question even some of our teachers, right? This is something that in my experiences of teaching astrology, for example, I found that this is very challenging for a lot of people to do, because the people who are really attracted to the idea of devotion can be very set in their ways. They are good students, right? They want to get the gold star. And so when the teacher tells them to do XYZ, they just do it enthusiastically, and then they keep doing the same thing, and they don't want to change. They fear asking the big questions, right? And then maybe the people who are more Gemini, who are not afraid to ask the big questions, who are not afraid to jump from one modality to the other, often does so in a way that I think it's a little too fast. When you jump from one ship to the other too fast, when you change from one teacher or one community or one modality too fast, often you don't get to see the fruits of your labor, And um, that's not always true, right? Sometimes I think there's something to be said about pollination as well. Like sometimes something that is maybe seeded through a study of one modality, maybe something that you harvest when you've already left that modality or that teacher or that community, right? But I do think that really centering ourselves around having a flexible commitment, right? Flexible and expansive commitment to our craft um, is is kind of an interesting balance to play with, right? And can be really a fertile soil and can teach us a lot about what it means to be a part of, to be someone who practices a certain modality while also at the same time being open, to that modality being shifted, right? I think being open and being discerning are not mutually exclusive, and we can kind of cultivate both of these virtues together. I think there's something here too about trusting the cycles that, if you are in a place where maybe you practice a certain modality that don't seem to have a lot of traction, or people don't really know a lot about it, or people are confused about what it is that you do exactly. Um, if that modality is something that really means a lot to you, if it's something that really feels deeply moving to you and your heart and has been beneficial for you in your daily life, I would say keep at it. There's something to be said about really trusting that there will come a time when this modality will have its time, will have its moment to shine in the spotlight, so to speak. Um, Another thing that I would also suggest is having an orientation towards mastery. Now, mastery is kind of a challenging word. I know that that word has become, um, let me put it this way, that word has potentially oppressive uh, history, right? And that might not be the right word for you, but it's the word that resonates with me. I certainly see that part of the distortion around wanting to become a master or wanting to have power over other people in a way that's oppressive is actually, in my opinion, due to the lack of embracing our own self agency and the lack of cultivating the skills and the desires to, you know, basically build self mastery. In any case, um, I think orienting towards mastery or proficiency or fluency, is something that is always helpful, you know? And you get to define what mastery, what proficiency, what fluency looks like for yourself. You don't need to take anybody else's ideas of what mastery looks like. You know, for me, for example, this is something I struggled with for a very long time because I've always found it very attractive when someone is very knowledgeable about their craft, very fluent in their craft. And um, yet, what I found to be truly motivating for me when it comes to mastery, proficiency, or fluency is I want to be able to use a particular modality or a particular practice or framework in a way that's helpful for myself and really moves the needle in terms of my own lived experience, my own relationship with myself, my relationship with those around me, my relationship with the world at large, right? And for the people that I work with. And included in my own definition of mastery personally is I want to know when not to use the tools, right? Every tool has their own strengths and weaknesses. I feel like tools are kind of like humans. We all have things that are really great about us and things that are not so great about us. And so, what I think is deeply important to remember is that certain tools are right for addressing certain kinds of issues, or certain tools are right for certain people at certain time, right? There's very rarely any tool that works for everyone at all times. I certainly have found that to be very elusive. I haven't found a practice that I would say I can safely recommend for everyone at all points in their lives. Maybe with the exception of grounding, but even grounding um, has prerequisites, right? We may need to do some other type of work before we can even get to a place where we can ground, and there are many different ways to ground, right? Um, so, yeah, I think what I will leave you all with is the idea of utilizing our creativity with our spiritual work, right? With our spiritual tools. Um, when it comes to spiritual frameworks and tools, because many of us learn it from a teacher of some sort or some lineage that our teachers belong to, it can feel like a travesty to explore other ways of doing something, right? But something that I've found to be quite helpful too is that, again, practices are really dynamic, that um, it can be really exciting to practice the way that we've been taught, right, up to a certain point. And then it might be really instructive for us to try to see if we can achieve some of the same effects, or get to some of the same states using slightly different tools. And it may be really helpful for us to do that. It may be um, really illuminating in terms of leading us back to why the practices and the lineages and the frameworks are set up the way that they're set up. With a lot of esoteric practices and lineages, there are often layers that are hidden, right? There are often layers that, even if they were told to you at the very beginning stage of your studies, will not totally make sense to you. And so, a lot of the times, in my experience, some of the best teachers understand this principle and they don't give everything to their students all the time. And so it may take you years of practice and kind of breaking down your practice, right? Like there's, I think, one stage where we practice the practice, and then there's a stage where we kind of toy around with the practice a little bit, or we mess up the practice a little bit so that we get to see how it works. It's kind of like um, the radio, right? I think for most of us, we just use our radio to listen to music, or use our phones, I guess, to listen to music. But for people who really want to learn how um, phones are made, at some point they may really need to open up a phone and see the inside of that phone, right? And I think our spiritual practices and frameworks are also very similar. The act of deconstructing them can really help us see something deeper that are not immediately apparent from our kind of day-to-day use of them. All right. This episode has turned out to be a pretty long episode. I hope this is useful for you. I hope this discussion is interesting. And I'm certainly interested in hearing how this lands for you. If you would like to share, yeah, reach out to me. You know all the ways to find me. Leave a comment or find me on social media, or send me an email to the email that's like, in the show notes. All right. Announcements. Yes, I will be sharing a little bit more about this class, Deep Spirit Medicine, that I'm going to be running. It's going to start on July 18th, which is on Thursday. And it's starting very, very soon. I have very limited space. I will only open 20 spots, and yeah, it's going to be an intimate group of people, and we're going to learn some of the foundations of energy cultivation. And this is a curriculum that I inherited from my teacher, Deborah Kremens, who trained me to teach this material. And so, yeah, I am, this is one of those practices that I continue to use throughout my journey. And I found them to be extremely practical, extremely helpful. And so I would like to invite you to join us if you feel like that would be interesting to you. And yeah, I will be making more of a formal announcement a little bit later this week. So if you know that you're already interested, feel free to sign up for the waitlist in the link below. And if you would like to work with me one-on-one, I still have some space in July, and I would love to see you. We can do an astrology reading, we can do a divination session, or we can do subtle alchemy work, which is essentially some combination of energy work and Akashic work. And it would be such a joy for me to share that space with you and share that work with you, and facilitate your deeper understanding of yourself and your path and where you're currently at. Okay, I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the next time we gather, whether it be through this podcast or some other offerings. Take care.